Kate Andrews is our economics correspondent. She edits the Spectator's daily COVID-19 update email. It is one of the biggest COVID newsletters in the world. She joins me now. Kate, talk us through where we are with the vaccine in Britain. Now, I saw the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, get quite emotional about it. He clearly thought this was a turning point.
Yes, he got teary on Breakfast TV talking about this turning point, and it is a turning point. Andrew, I think we can definitively say that every day now we are taking steps to be closer to protecting the vulnerable in the UK. Margaret Keenan was the first person to get the Pfizer jab on Tuesday. She's turning 91 years old next week. This is one jab of 800,000 that are meant to be administered in the coming weeks. That's 400,000 people that are going to be inoculated. And this jab from Pfizer is thought to be effectively 95% effective. So I think it's safe to say that we are getting a lot closer to protecting our vulnerable, but there's still a lot of outstanding questions as to the timeline, how many vaccines the UK is actually going to procure, how many more are going to come online, and how we continue to learn to live with this virus because we're far away from saying that everybody is safe.
How seriously do we take these reports of two NHS workers had quite severe reactions to the Pfizer vaccine? Is that just, that's what happens, there are a few who do, or is it more serious than that?
Well, when Pfizer was running its safety tests, they did find that roughly 1 in 1,000 people might have had an allergic reaction. This is something that can happen with all kinds of vaccinations, including the flu jab. There are warnings about allergic reactions. I think the concern around this one, it's two NHS workers who had an allergic reaction. They're now thought to be recovering. It was a short-term reaction. It was by no means fatal, but the concern is that the UK regulator has now updated the guidance after people started to receive the jab, and I think it goes to this broader point of how officials need to be really honest and transparent and communicative about the data and the safety around this vaccine. Polls across the UK show that certainly over 50% of the UK residents plan to take this vaccine, 60%, 70% depending on which poll you're looking at, and that's pretty good data. And for those who are skeptical, it's usually not because they actually have anti-vaxxer opinions, but they just want to know more about the safety. So I think incidents like this speak to the fact that officials really need to get out there and communicate about why these jabs are safe, the slight risks that can be involved. But there's a great piece on the Spectator website right now from Dr. Mark Toshner talking about how the risks are extremely low and why it's a good idea to get this vaccine.
Right. Well, that's worth reading. Kate, bring us up to date now on the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. The United Kingdom has bought already 100 million doses, a lot more than it bought on the Pfizer one. But where are we with that? When do we think that can be rolled out?
So if the Oxford vaccine were to come online, we would more or less have enough doses of this vaccine to go around, certainly to protect the vulnerable and those in older age groups. It's where the UK has invested most when it comes to these jabs, but it's becoming increasingly complex. When Oxford first reported on its efficiency rate, it said it was roughly 70% effective, but we found out when that number was broken down that it was 62% effective for the large cohort that had a certain kind of dose given, and then it was 90% effective if the jabs were given in different doses. And so now there are questions, and the Lancet has done a big report this week as to what a UK regulator can actually approve. Some of the questions are around age. Perhaps they might approve it for the under 55s. The 90% efficiency rate was only tested on those under 55s. It's thought that they may need to go back into a phase 3 trial, but the Lancet highlights that if this vaccine were to be between 60 to 80% effective, its authors think that you would still need certain kinds of social distancing measures, ones that we know the Prime Minister and I'm sure many people, perhaps the vast majority in the UK, would really like to throw out the window as soon as possible. The idea of a vaccine is that it is supposed to be a silver bullet, so one that isn't a silver bullet is not going to be looked as favorably on. So there's still a lot of outstanding questions around Oxford. If and when it comes online, it will be a game changer, as I said, because hopefully we could really speed up that timeline for getting this vaccine out there and injecting lots of people. But if it doesn't come online for a while, it does slow down the process. The UK has invested in the Pfizer vaccine, the Moderna vaccine, which hopefully comes online soon. But by and large, it's really relying on Oxford.
And finally, Kate, the economics of all this, we got the latest UK GDP figures today, showed the economy growing for the 6th consecutive month, but it also showed that growth was beginning to peter out by October. Nothing like the growth, the bounce back after the horrendous fall in the economy in March and April. It would seem, looking at these figures, that although the economy may have been a bit more resilient than some might have thought, it could now be stagnating through November into December, and that we really need the rollout of these vaccines early in the new year if we're to see life back in the economy again by Easter, early summer. Is that correct?
I fear it could be worse than that, Andrew. We saw the economy start to stall in its progress in August, which was arguably the most open month of the year when it comes to COVID restrictions, the ability to socialize, and for shops to be open. And one of the reasons it's stagnating is because we've learned that if certain restrictions are in place, there's only so much that an economy can really recover. But I think it's going to do worse than stagnate. It's very likely that when we get November's figures, we're going to see another economic contraction, albeit not nearly as big as what we saw in April. But England's second lockdown and the forced reclosure of shops and non-essential business is bound to have a bad impact on the economy. Now, a lot of these forecasters say the good news is that if vaccines come online, if we are inoculating millions of people in the UK by next spring, we could be in a much better position rolling back those social distancing measures. And some forecasters have suggested we should look to their optimistic scenarios now, not their central scenarios, which usually on average show the UK economy recovering by early 2022 as opposed to the end of 2022. And that is a big and meaningful difference, but it is going to require a lot to happen with vaccines in a relatively short period of time. And I think when we look at the trajectory of 2020, because we know the vaccine's not going to have that impact this year, you're going to see not a V-shaped recovery, not a Nike-shaped recovery, but actually quite a wonky W, because we are likely to have that second economic contraction.
I'm just going to contemplate a wonky W. Kate Han
doesn't look good.
Economic correspondent for The Spectator. Thank you for being with us on Spectator TV today. Now, China has been vaccinating its population with unapproved vaccines since July. The estimate is that 1 million people have been vaccinated. None of these jabs have received regulatory approval. It may be why state media has been relatively hush-hush about this vaccination program. Cindy Yu is the Spectator's broadcast editor. She's host of our Chinese Whispers podcast, which, if you want to know what is happening in China, is a must listen. And she writes about the vaccination program on our Coffee House website this week. Cindy, welcome to Spectator TV. Just tell us a little bit about what's been happening then. I mean, 1 million people is not a lot in a country the size of China. Nobody's really talked about it. What kind of vaccine is it? Why 1 million? Who's doing it? What do we know?
So, Andrew, starting from the beginning, as you said, this started in July. That was when China introduced this legislative loophole based on WHO emergency response to Ebola outbreak, which was basically saying, in an emergency situation, you can vaccinate frontline health workers, frontline transport workers, and so on. What the new legislation has said in China, though, is that if you're going abroad to high-risk countries, you can also get the vaccine. So what that means is that the top producers of vaccines in China, there are 3 of them: Sinopharm, which is a state-owned company, Sinovac, which is a private company, and CanSino, which is a military-developed one. Since July, they've been injecting people. So Sinopharm has been injecting its own company employees. Some of them are Huawei employees as well, who go abroad, do these foreign contracts in different countries, and then some of them have even come back and got into trouble with border control in Shanghai because they had antibodies that they were detected. And so CanSino has been injecting soldiers. We don't know much about the injections of these two companies because they've been keeping relatively quiet about who they're injecting and how many, although Sinopharm claims to have injected nearly 1 million people. What I've been looking at in particular is Sinovac's vaccination. They've been doing this in Zhejiang province, which has 57 million people. So as you say, 1 million is a drop in the ocean for that. And the requirement there is to go abroad, or if you're one of these frontline workers. What has happened is that on social media, this has caused something of a millennial furore because all people 20-somethings who study abroad, something of a rite of passage for young Chinese people these days, they're all clamouring for the vaccine. And in most of Zhejiang province, you have to be a local resident in order to get the vaccine. But in this one tiny city of 1 million people, Yiwu, you can get the vaccine as long as you provide plane ticket, some kind of proof that you're going abroad. And so on social media, everyone's recommending Yiwu as a place to go. How do you get on the waiting list? How much does it cost? And all that sort of stuff, because they're not getting much guidance from state media because, as you say, national state media really hasn't touched it at all. You'd think that this would be something that Global Times, the very jingoistic nationalist tabloid paper, would be having a field day on, that China started vaccinating so early. But they haven't, and I think the reason for that is because these vaccines are in phase 3 trials. The only reason they're allowed to be rolled out is because they count as emergency vaccinations.
Two questions, Cindy. Is there any evidence of untoward reactions to this vaccine? I mean, do we have any idea how this vaccine has performed, even though it hasn't finished its full trial yet? And if the Chinese authorities do have confidence in it, despite the trials not yet being completed, why only 1 million people?
I think those are good questions, Andrew. So on the first one, the UAE, which is one of the first countries in the world to be rolling out Sinopharm's vaccine, has said that it's 86% effective, but none of the data has been released, and that was only yesterday. So there's no peer review for that. There's no verification process for that. They claim that no one has had adverse reactions. But one student I spoke to, one 20-something-year-old who studies in London but is in Beijing, when he got vaccinated, he didn't leave contact details. They haven't contacted him since. So I don't know how these companies would know if anyone did have an adverse reaction because they're not tracking it as far as I can see. I guess if you're more systematically getting it because it's a place of work, then there might be more of a route there, more of a mechanism. I think that China hasn't wanted to do a mass rollout because it wants to see how this vaccine goes. China doesn't have a great track record when it comes to food and drug safety. Viewers might have heard of the 2008 milk powder scandal where melamine-infused baby formula hospitalized tens of thousands of babies. So since then, China has done a lot of work on finessing that system. But it was only 2 years ago when another vaccine manufacturer, not any of the ones involved here, was fined over $1 billion for putting out faulty rabies vaccines. So China doesn't have a great record on it. I think if I was Xi Jinping right now, I wouldn't necessarily want to put my face on these vaccines before they're approved. And so that's probably why it's only had 1 million people. It's only rolling out in one province so far, although more may follow by the end of the year, because they're trying to see what's going to happen with that. Interestingly, though, last week Sinopharm did apply for regulatory approval. So I wonder if the Western vaccines progress has kind of, jolted them into waking up a bit.
They could have done well. They could have encouraged them to speed things up. If the stage 3 trials are successful, and if it gets a clean bill of health, is the Chinese state on standby with massive stockpiles of this vaccine? I mean, is it ready to roll this out in huge numbers, and even to the extent that it might think of exporting or licensing this vaccine around the world?
Absolutely. So as well as China starting emergency vaccination, as I mentioned, UAE has also given it approval for emergency vaccination. So Sinopharm is already exporting to the UAE. Countries from Pakistan to Indonesia to Brazil have been striking deals with China to get these vaccines. And the interesting thing about the Chinese vaccines, all three of them, are that they don't need to be in a particularly cold temperature. They don't need to be -70. They just need to be at a relatively easier temperature. So for the developing world, because it's going to be A, mass produced by China with its capacity, and also B, because it will be easier to store, that will be a much more preferable option for poorer countries to deal with than, say, the Oxford vaccine. So in that sense, it is going to go global. Within China, there's a national procurement scheme. And so one public health expert I spoke to said that this might be why companies are so keen to roll out their vaccines now before they get approval, because once they get co-opted into the state scheme, they might not get a say over their prices. So they might as well start cashing in now, but that's just his theory.
All right, Cindy Yu, Spectator's broadcast editor, also the author of our podcast, Chinese Whispers, always worth listening to. Thank you for joining us, Cindy. And that's it for this week. Thanks to our other guests, and once again, to our very special sponsor, Charles Stanley. Charles Stanley is one of the UK's leading wealth management firms, one of the oldest firms on the London Stock Exchange.